obsession, passion for him burns like fire.
Hi, I'm Jeff Evanson. I want to welcome you back to the third session of our course on the return of Jesus. Today, we're going to be talking about the negatives, the negative aspects of this time frame. My name is Jeff Evanson, and if you want to contact me for questions or for the notes for this course, you can write me at toknowjesusmore@gmail.com, and I will respond as best I can. Okay. So what are some of the negatives in this time frame? Now, the return of Jesus, the whole time frame of his return is full of crisis and chaos and different things like that. And so we want to talk about some of these negative aspects. This is what most people think about when they think about the return of Jesus, is how bad it is. But we need to know these things so that as we see them happening, we're aware and we keep our hearts connected with Jesus, because he's the only one who will keep us steady through this time for those who will be there. So the first negative is the day of the Lord. Now, this is positive for believers, but it's not for unbelievers, also known as the day of Yahweh. We're going to be looking at some negative trends. We're going to look at some negative people, and we'll look at some of the negative events that are described in the scriptures. So the day of the Lord, it's described as the terrible day of the Lord, and it's because it's terrible for the rebellious and the wicked and the unsaved. It's the last thing they want to happen. They want to live their lives in their sin with full freedom, but the terrible day of the Lord is going to confront them in their sin. It's going to be the most severe outpouring of God's judgment in history. Nothing will compare to it. It's going to be a chaotic and confusing time in human history. It's going to bring much trouble, and there's going to be great confusion in this time. People are going to be wandering around without hope, lost. They're not going to be able to see anything clearly. And the only thing that they're going to look at is the Antichrist and his kingdom. And it's going to look good for a while, but then he's going to turn on them as well. Jesus says this in Matthew 24:15. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand. Then there will be great tribulation, such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will be. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. When we think about history, human history, and the great trials that nations have gone through, that people groups have gone through, that even when you think about the flood that wiped out all of humanity except for Noah and his family, Jesus is telling us that nothing will compare to what's coming. That the tribulation, the great crisis on the earth is going to be far worse than anything mankind can think of in the past. World War II, nothing's going to compare to it. That, even dropping a bomb in Hiroshima, nothing is going to compare to the horrors of this time frame. As we look at some of the trends, there's going to be 4 sources of pressure that we need to understand. 4 sources of pressure coming upon the people on the earth. It's going to be coming from 4 different directions. And the first one is God's wrath is being poured on the rebellious. God is going to be doing things on the earth that are specifically targeted at the wicked and the rebellious, the Antichrist. anyone who has denied Jesus is going to be, dealing with the wrath of God during this time. There will be no question about it. Revelation 6:15-17 says this: Then the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said to the mountains and to the rocks, Fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For great day of their wrath has come. Who is able to stand? The second source of pressure will be the rage of Satan against believers and all humanity. We read about this in Revelation 12. And there was war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. Now, this isn't the throne room of God heaven, okay? We understand from the scriptures that there are actually 3 levels, 3 layers of heaven, so to speak. There's the natural realm where we look up, we see the sun, the stars, the sky. That's the natural heavens. That's the first heaven. And the scripture often talks about that level of heaven. Paul tells us about when he was taken to the third heaven being the throne room of God. And he saw things that were indescribable as he was looking at God and his throne or whatever he was seeing. But there's the second heaven. There's a second heaven where the angels and the demons rule, okay? So to speak. They have positions of authority. They have responsibilities. The scripture talks about the principalities and such things like that left their position where they were supposed to be, and that's the realm we're talking about. Well, in this war that occurs in the second heaven, Michael and his angels actually defeat the devil, the dragon and his angels. And it says the dragon and his angels waged war. And they were not strong enough, and there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, the serpent of old, who's called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, and he was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So there's going to come a point in time where Satan and his angels get cast out of the second heaven, and they're bound to the earth. They have nowhere else to go. They're stuck on this planet with us, with humanity. And then in verse 13, and when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to the earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. This is not talking about Mary. This is talking about, we understand the woman to be the redeemed, the righteous of Israel, the righteous children of Abraham. And out of those people came forth Jesus, who, the male child. And then it says, the dragon was so enraged with the woman that he went off to make war with the rest of her children, who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. So the people on the earth at this time are dealing with the rage of Satan at a level that's been beyond anything we've experienced. And so that's one of the pressures of these 7 years. It's going to be directed against believers from Satan himself, okay? Doesn't mean Satan himself is going to be looking at you, but his demons are going to be functioning and waging war against the church, against Israel, against all believers on the earth in that time. The third pressure is the fullness of man's sin on the earth. Man's sin is going to come to full maturity in this last 7 years. We understand this idea of sin becoming mature when we consider the story of Abraham. Abraham was told by God that he would be the father of many nations, and that his children would go to Egypt for 400 years where they would be enslaved. And the reason that they were going to be there for 400 years was because the people in Canaan, their sin had not come to full ripeness. God couldn't judge them yet because they haven't shown themselves to be who they are, the wickedness that was in their heart, so to speak. But after 400 years, when Israel came out of Egypt, God sent them into Canaan to take the land that he promised to Abraham. And as part of that process, God, through the Israelites, released judgment upon the Canaanites, upon the Amalekites and the Amorites and all the other ites that were living there, because the fullness of their sin had finally matured. And it was ripe to the point where God was justified in causing them to be wiped out. And that was his command to Israel. So globally, this is going to happen. We read in Revelation 9, this is after the sixth trumpet, that the rest of mankind who were not killed by these plagues did not repent of the works of their hands so as not to worship demons and the idols of gold and of silver and of brass and of stone and of wood, which can neither see nor hear nor walk, and they did not repent of their murders, nor their sorceries, nor their immorality, nor their thefts. So the sin of the wickedness of man is going to crescendo in this time to the point where it's fully ripe. It's going to get as bad as it can possibly get. And today, as we look around our world, we're seeing some stuff that we just shake our heads at. It's hard to believe what we're hearing about things, all this pedophilia and this, Epstein stuff, and all the people at high levels involved with this kind of stuff. And, that's just the beginning. We're just seeing, hints of it today. It's going to be full blown in this last time. The wickedness in the heart of man is just going to come to its fullness. This murders and sorceries and immorality beyond anything we can imagine today. Slavery is going to be a huge deal, and the sexual slavery that we're hearing about today, that's been going on for under the covers for many years, but it's coming out, and it's people are reacting to it, and some people are defending it. Pedophilia is a sexual orientation that should be protected. It's like, oh my gosh, doesn't your heart just cringe when you hear something like that? But that's what's happening. We're seeing the beginnings of this trend, and it's going to just get worse globally, all over the whole planet. The fourth pressure is going to be the earth itself. The earth we're told, is going to reel to and fro like it's drunk. And, the natural world is going to just erupt with so many things. Jesus talks about it in Matthew 24. In various places, there will be famines and earthquakes. But all of these things are merely the beginnings of birth pangs. So we're seeing some of these things. Again, these are trends now. We want to see them all grow together. But we've been seeing natural stuff happening throughout the earth. But it's just going to keep getting more and more and more. And in these last 7 years, it's going to be, there's levels of devastation naturally that in many ways we can't imagine. Now, there's going to be two severe waves of death. The first wave, there's a quarter of the population of the earth is going to die. This is in the early part of the last 3.5 years. We read in Revelation 6:8, and this is the fourth seal that's released. And behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. According to authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth, to kill with sword, with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. The second wave of death comes at the sixth trumpet, and we read about it this way. It says it's going to be a third of those remaining. A third of mankind was killed by these three plagues, by the fire, and the smoke, and the brimstone, which proceeded out of the mouths of this demonic horde that was killing people everywhere. So let's look at this visually a little bit. If this all happened today, in 2020, the Earth today is estimated to be have about 8 billion people on it. Now, a billion is a big number, and you could not count to a billion just vocally in your lifespan. It would take 120 years if you didn't eat, sleep, or drink. Okay, so a billion is a big number. Well, let's divide this in quarters, because a quarter of the population dies, and a quarter of 8 billion is 2 billion, a huge number. And so in the first wave of death, a quarter of the earth has died, 2 billion people would die. That's massive. When you think of some of the events that have killed lots of people in the last 20 years, the earthquake on Haiti killed maybe 200,000 to 300,000 people. That was a huge number. That was horrible. But it doesn't even drop. It's only a drop on the bucket compared to 2 billion people. And then it says a third of those remaining after that. So there's 3 quarters left. So a third of that's another quarter. So it's another 2 billion people. So by this time, half the planet has died. That's 4 billion people in less than 3.5 years. That is a serious number. It's going to be unbelievable. It's really, our minds cannot comprehend it at this point in time. It's unbelievable. Another trend that we're going to see is a great falling away. Now, these are believers, people who confess Jesus, who are going to turn their hearts against him. And their hearts are usually their hearts are turned against him because their hearts become offended at him. And Jesus said, "Blessed are the ones who do not become offended at me." Remember when he was with his disciples and he told this crowd of people, "You need to eat my blood and drink my body." And they became offended and said most of his disciples no longer walked with him. They turned away from him, even though they'd been following him, even though they were loving him and loving what he was saying. He offended them. And their hearts hardened against him, and they left. Now, in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, talks about this great falling away and calls it the apostasy. Apostasy simply means to fall away. Let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first. The it here is the day of the Lord. The it here is the return of Jesus. Okay? And then continuing in Matthew 24, Jesus says this, "Then they will deliver you to tribulation." Okay, so now we're in the first half of the 7 years, and they will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. And at that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. So this falling away, this great apostasy is going to happen in the first 3.5 years of the tribulation. Now, what about today? We see some of these trends happening, right? We see things like COVID. It's a pandemic that's killed maybe, I don't know what the numbers are today, 100,000 to 200,000 people around the world. Really minor compared to 2 billion people. We see lawlessness erupting throughout the U.S. and other countries around the world. We see catastrophes like in Beirut, Lebanon, where this storehouse exploded and wreaked havoc for many miles, killing at least 100 people. But again, 100 people is, as tragic as it is, it's nothing compared to 2 billion people. Every summer we see fires in California. This summer they're saying these fires are bigger than any fire they've ever had. So that's kind of a trending thing to take note of. Of course, Australia this summer had many fires around it. It was greatly exaggerated by our news media, but they had fires they're dealing with. There's always fires on the earth somewhere, but it's these are things that were trending, that we're watching to see, are they happening the same time all these other things are happening, etc. There was something unique that happened in Iowa just in the last couple of weeks. There was a storm that came through, that this type of storm only comes like once every 100 years, apparently. But it was like it was a ripple storm, and they call it a hurricane strength storm that came through. And, it flattened crops, destroyed people's farms, destroyed homes, destroyed cities. It was a horrendous event in the middle of America that doesn't get hurricanes. But this storm was far greater than any, tornado that hit Iowa. So these are all things that are happening around us today. And things we're watching are these, 2020 is clearly a unique year with all the stuff that's happening. Is it going to change? Is it going to calm down again? Or is it going to keep increasing? We don't know. We have an election coming up in November. That election, regardless of what direction it's going to go, is probably going to have some reaction to it. And there's going to be additional unrest that's going to arise in this nation. But let's talk about some of the negative people. In Revelation 13, we read about the beast. Now, the beast we know to be the Antichrist. And this guy is going to rise up, and he's going to be wicked. But there's something we need to know about the spirit of Antichrist. There's a spirit of Antichrist that's been in the world since the time of the apostles. John writes about it in 1 John 4:3, and he says, "And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of Antichrist, of which you have heard is coming, and now is already in the world." So back when John was writing this, he identified that the spirit of Antichrist was already there. Okay. Now, in chapter 2 earlier, he writes this. He says, "Children, it's the last hour. And just as you heard that Antichrist is coming, even now many Antichrists have appeared. And from this, we know it is the last hour." So he's identifying that there is the Antichrist, and there's also many Antichrists. So these many Antichrists are those who would, declare themselves to be God, who would, or a prophet or something that's detracting from Jesus and his place. Many cults. These are, many of these cults are led by these little Antichrists throughout church history. But there is an Antichrist that's coming. John continues, he says, "Who is the liar but the one that denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, the one who denies the Father and the Son." It's interesting. If you study the teachings of Islam, one of their big things that they say is that God has no son. And therefore, they deny that Jesus is the Son of God, that Jesus is God. They consider him a failed prophet. But just keep that in mind, all right? Now, some people question if this Antichrist is going to be a real person. Is it not just a personification of evil that's in the world today that's causing all this unrest and causing all this evil to happen? But in Revelation 19, we read this. "And I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. And the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone." Well, let's look at this verse. "I saw the beast and the kings of the earth and their armies." So the kings of the earth are real people. Their armies are real people. Okay? So why would the beast not be a real person? Is he just this cloud of something leading all these guys? Well, the beast was seized. So they were assembled against Jesus. They were assembled to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. So Jesus is sitting on his horse, and he's got an army with him. This army is real. Jesus is real. He's not a personification of good. It's really Jesus. So the beast must be a real person. And what happens to him and the false prophet? They're thrown alive into the lake of fire. You don't throw an idea alive into the lake of fire. You throw a person alive into the lake of fire. So the beast, the Antichrist, is a real person that will rise up in this time frame. He will be the most evil man in all of history. There's no one who will compare to him. His wickedness will far exceed any evil dictator that's ever lived. You know, we've seen different evil men rise up in history, and when we look at them, we see them as a foreshadowing of who he will be. For example, if you look at let's go back to like 125 BC. There was this man named Antiochus Epiphanes. He was a Greek king over Syria, okay? And he came into Jerusalem, and he sacrificed a pig on the altar, desecrated the temple, and it was as a result of that, the Israelis rose up as the Maccabean force and kicked him and his armies out of the country. And we have today, because of that event, we have Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights. Another evil man was Nero. He was Caesar, and he was Caesar during the time of the early church. And Nero hated Christians, he hated Jews, and he caused a great persecution to rise against the church during his reign. And he was so wicked that he even used Christians as human torches to light the streets and light his courtyards. He was a horrendously evil man. Some people, look at him and say, well, he was the Antichrist, but he was a foreshadowing of the Antichrist because he did not fulfill everything that the Antichrist is going to do. Another person who was thought to be the Antichrist was Hitler. Hitler and his war that he was raging, the triggering World War II, killing 6 million Jews and causing millions of others as well to die. Many people at the time thought he was the Antichrist. But there's so many things he didn't fulfill. But he's a foreshadowing of the evil wickedness of the Antichrist. Of course, there's Joseph Stalin, and he killed 20 to 60 million of his own people in the Soviet Union. And then Mao Zedong, he killed 45 million people in China in 4 years. So if you take all of these guys, all these wicked leaders, put them together, you begin to get an idea of the wickedness of the Antichrist, but nothing's going to compare. There's nothing. He's going to be the most wicked man in the history of humanity. Other people, there's the false prophet in Revelation 13. We read about him, and he's called the second beast. And we're told that he rises up out of the earth. Well, there's a little mystery for you, but this man is going to be the one doing signs and wonders on behalf of the Antichrist, and he's going to cause many to follow the Antichrist. Those who have studied Islamic eschatology have found a commonality between the Islamic Messiah and the false prophet of Revelation 13. So there's a possibility, because the spirit of Antichrist is embedded with Islam, that this false prophet could be connected to Islam in some way. And then the Islamic nations, the Islamic people will look to this false prophet and call him their Messiah. And he'll be a false Jesus, be a false Messiah. During this time, there's going to be a confederation of 10 nations. Now, there's 10 nations that we read about that will come together around the Antichrist. He's probably one of these nations. He's probably leading one of these nations. But this is not the European Union. For many years, people looked at the European Union when there was 8 nations as part of the union and go, oh, this must be it. This must be it. And it got to 10. It's like, oh, this is it. And then it went to 11 and 12 and 13. And it's like, oh, I guess it wasn't it. Some people still teach that, but the European Union today is kind of disintegrating in some ways, and we don't know if it's going to survive the next number of years. But the Confederation of 10 Nations, if you look at the Roman Empire, because it's a revived Roman Empire, if you look at the Roman Empire at the time when John got this vision, they owned all the territory around the Mediterranean, and they owned Britain, and they owned into, they controlled like into Iraq and east a little bit. So it's very likely going to be the nations around there, which are predominantly Islamic today, although you've got Greece and Rome and Turkey. And, well, Turkey is for sure Islamic, but anyway, there's just 10 nations that are going to come together under the Antichrist and commit their loyalty to him. Now, Israel is a positive, but Israel also has a negative. And as a signpost, there's going to be some very difficult times for Israel coming. And so we will be watching the people of Israel around the world and seeing some very negative things happening with them as well. Let's talk about some of the events. There's this event called the abomination of desolation. We find this in Daniel 11, verses 31 and 36, and we read it this way. And forces from him shall appear and profane the temple and fortress, and shall take away the regular burnt offering, and they shall set up the abomination that makes desolate. So there's a king, and his forces are going to profane the temple and the fortress, stop the regular burnt offering, and set up an abomination that makes desolate. Now, in 175 BC, Antiochus Epiphanes did just this. And so they often thought that he was the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy here, because he went in to the temple and he sacrificed a pig on the temple and desecrated the temple, causing the Jewish people to rise up in revolt against him. And they actually fought against his armies and pushed them out of Israel. That battle and all that's around that is where we get the celebration of Hanukkah, the Feast of Lights. Now, we continue reading in verse 1136. It says, and the king shall do as he wills, he shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god, and shall speak astonishing things against the God of gods. And he will prosper until the indignation is accomplished, for what is decreed shall be done. So God has already set in place that this king who desecrates the temple and calls himself God is going to be for a certain amount of time until it's all complete. God has decreed this, okay? Now, let's look in Matthew 24, what Jesus says. Because many people actually think those prophecies were fulfilled through Antiochus Epiphanes, but Jesus says this 180 plus years later. So when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by prophet Daniel, so Jesus is referring to Daniel's prophecy, you see it happening, standing in the holy place, let the reader understand, and let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. So Jesus is saying it was still future. Antiochus Epiphanes and what he did was the past. So this is one of those events that we consider a foreshadowing. We actually can see it a little bit, what it might look like, because some parts of it happened, but it's still to come in fullness. 2 Thessalonians, Paul talks about this event. He says, let no one in any way deceive you, for it will not come unless the apostasy comes first. Paul is talking about the it here is the return of Jesus, okay? It says the man of lawlessness, this is another term we understand to be the Antichrist, he will be revealed. the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship. This is exactly how Daniel described him. So that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. This is exactly what Daniel described this man doing. Another event that's going to happen is an assassination of the Antichrist. Revelation 13:13, we read that the beast has 7 heads, and one of these heads has a fatal wound on it. Okay, and so this is understood to be the assassination, that he actually dies. The Antichrist actually dies at this point in time, but then he's miraculously brought back to life, and it astounds the people of the world, and they look at him and say, "Who's ever heard of such a thing?" And the false prophet's going to say things like, "Have you ever seen Jesus? They say he was resurrected. Have you seen him? No, but this man has died and was resurrected, and you see him right in front of you. Worship him." Okay, things like that are going to happen. As a result, there's going to be the false prophet's going to make this image of the beast, and this image is going to be able to see and hear, and it causes people who don't have the mark of the beast to be killed. So there's something about this beast. I'm sure there's going to be a technology involved. It's going to be demonically inspired and connected and everything. Probably going to be set up throughout the world, and it's going to be able to detect if you have your mark or not. And if someone walks by, it senses they're walking by, and they don't have this mark, a chip. I mean, the mark is not a chip, but anyway, something connected to that mark that's going to alert this image, and then it's going to call out and maybe call the police or whatever. So it's going to be a real thing that's going to be set up, and it's going to create havoc on our earth because of it. Talking about the mark of the beast, this is something on the head and the forehead that is required for you to buy or sell. Now, this is not the chip in and of itself. There's technology today that's being developed, and in my past work history, I actually was working in these realms that would help identify people. But there's technology, such as the chip and other things that in and of itself is neutral. It's good, used for good purposes. It's not evil by itself. The problem is the infrastructure that's being built today will eventually be taken over by the Antichrist, and he will use it against us. So he will use it in an evil way. Now the chip, if the chip were to be it, the chip itself is not evil. It's just technology. It's no different than having a pencil. It's no different than having, a phone. That, it's technology, it's used for good, it can be used for evil. The mark of the beast is an act of worship. Okay? People are going to put it on their foreheads because they're just boldly saying, "I worship this man. He's God. I'm worshiping him. Whatever." It's not something that you can be forced to take. So you can't get an accident, through an injection and suddenly you got the mark of the beast. That's not going to happen. You may get an injection and get a chip, but you're not going to get the mark of the beast. You can't fall asleep and wake up with the mark of the beast because someone walked in and gave it to you. You have to voluntarily take it, and it's an act of voluntary worship of the beast. Another big event that's going to happen is what's called the Battle for Jerusalem. Now, some people call this the Battle of Armageddon, but Armageddon is actually a series of battles. It's like a campaign through the Middle East. And the Battle for Jerusalem is actually the final battle. We read some of this in Psalm 2. David's prophesying. He says, "Why are the nations in an uproar, and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, Let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. The anointed one here is Jesus. And the nations of the earth are roaring and devising vanity to stand against Jesus. And they're saying, let us tear their fetters apart. They don't want any boundaries on morality. And we're seeing that today, aren't we? People are saying, it's all relative, and it's taken us to a point where such evil things are okay. They're calling evil good and good evil. In Zechariah 14, we read, behold, the day is coming for the Lord. In verse 2, and I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city shall be taken, and the houses plundered, women raped. Half the city will go out into exile, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city. So this is the battle for Jerusalem, okay? And the prophet's saying, God's saying, I'm gathering the nations. The Antichrist and the devil are going to gather the nations. So God and the devil are bringing the nations together against Jerusalem. A possible scenario could look like this. The Antichrist comes into Jerusalem, desecrates the temple, says, I'm God, okay? The Jews revolt against that, force them out of Jerusalem. As a result, he starts a battle. He starts gathering the nations against Jerusalem to deal with these Jews. And they actually are partially successful. There's a point in time where the armies of Israel are actually crushed. And we see here that half the city is taken. And there's great horrors going on in the city. But then we read that Jesus shows up. And the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. And on that day his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east. That's Jesus. We read about it in Revelation 19 as well. Then I saw an angel standing in the sun with a loud voice. He called to all the birds that fly directly overhead, come gather for the great supper of God, to eat the flesh of kings, the flesh of captains, the flesh of mighty men, the flesh of horses and their riders, and the flesh of all men, both free and slave, both great and small. This is the battle for Jerusalem. And I saw the beasts and the kings of the earth with their armies gathered to make war against him who is sitting on the horse and against his army. Now there's 3 consecutive series of judgments that are written in the book of Revelation. We see these as the seals in Revelation 6, the trumpets in Revelation 8 and 9, and the bowls in Revelation 16. Now there's a chart that you can download. It's a flow of the events of the last days, and we'll be doing a session on this later. But in this chart, you see in this area, this 3 judgment series. And so we see the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls. Now this is in order. So there's 7 seals, and they are opened in order. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 coming after 4, 6 coming after 5, etc. At the 7th seal, it releases the first trumpet. And the first trumpet precedes the second trumpet, which precedes the third trumpet. So it's in order. And it comes to the 7th trumpet. And the 7th trumpet begins the bowls. Okay, and so it goes on and forth. So it's all in order and sequential. Okay. So let's look at these seals briefly. The first seal is a rider on a white horse. This is the Antichrist revealed. You may read some places that they think that this is Jesus on his white horse, but no, this is the Antichrist. And he's revealed to the nations in some way, so people that the church begins to recognize him. The second seal is open. This is a scroll that Jesus has, and he's breaking the seals in the scroll. And there's a red horse, and the rider goes out, and he's allowed to release war upon the earth. Now, wars happen all over the earth today. But when this happens, there's going to be wars on a scale that will dwarf World War II. It's going to be global in nature, and it's going to be increasing in nature. The third seal is a rider on the black horse, and as happens often as a result of war, there's going to be famine. So it's going to cause great famine on the earth. And then the fourth rider's on a gray horse, and he's identified as death and Hades following him. And he's going to have the ability to kill, and there's going to be plague and disease and wild animals released with this one. Now the fifth seal is broken, and we are brought into heaven. And in heaven, there's a gold altar of incense, and under this altar are the souls of the martyrs, those who have been killed for the name of Jesus. Now the altar of incense is about prayer. And so these souls underneath the earth, underneath the altar, are actually crying out for justice. Saying, how long, O Lord, until you deal with those who killed us? And so it's actually a picture of intercession going on. And their intercession brings us to the sixth seal, which some amazing thing happens where heaven is opened. The skies are rolled back like a scroll, and people of the earth have a glimpse into heaven, and what they see is the Father sitting on his throne and Jesus with him as the Lamb. And then they cry out, hide us from the wrath of the Lamb. So there's something that happens in the sixth seal that the people of the earth begin to understand that Jesus is real, and he's coming, and he's going to come in anger and wrath, but it doesn't cause many of them to turn back to him. They want to hide from him. They want to run from him. And then the last seal is open. There's an earthquake on the earth, and then this leads us into the first trumpet. These trumpets are blown by angels, and we see them in Revelation 8 and 9. And the first trumpet is blown, and we see hail and fire and blood that's cast down upon the earth. And a third of the earth is burned. So, the fires that we've seen here and there, the big fires that in California, Australia, is nothing compared to what we're going to see here when a third of the earth is aflame. A second trumpet is blown, and there's a great burning mountain thrown into the sea. Some people think this is an asteroid, perhaps a comet, of a size that's not or an earth killer, so to speak. But what happens is it falls into the sea, and a third of the sea is turned to blood. So a third of the sea becomes unusable. It's you think of blood coagulating and stinking. It's just going to be horrendous, and what's in it dies in those areas. It's going to be the oceans. It's going to be some of the seas around the earth. We don't know which ones, but a third of them. Okay, the third trumpet sounds, and the stars fall from heaven. Probably meteorites, happening in some way that causes a third of the fresh water to be made bitter. So a third of drinking water in the earth is no longer drinkable. It's going to cause great problems. It's going to, we need water to survive, right? So there's going to be it's going to be a very big issue for the people on the earth at that time. Now, mind you, during these things that cause lack, the church is still going to be here, and God is going to be providing in miraculous ways. Moses struck the rock, and fresh water came out of the rock. I think there's going to be things like that's going to happen. We're going to see, miracles happening in terms of meeting our needs. But we'll talk about that later. Fourth trumpet. A third of the sun and moon and stars are darkened. This one's a bit of a mystery as how it's actually going to work out. It doesn't seem to indicate that it's just going to be dimmed. It seems to be more that we're actually going to see only a third of daylight. A third of daylight is going to disappear, but a third of the night is going to, so we're not going to see the moon, and we're not going to see a third of the stars. So my brain, trying to figure this out, just kind of says, well, maybe there's something up there blocking us from seeing the sun and the moon and the stars for a third of our 24-hour period or something. That something could very well be the New Jerusalem just sitting up there waiting to come. We'll see. It's a mystery. The fifth trumpet releases a demonic horde to torment unbelievers. Now these are demons that are released out of a pit, and they look like dragonflies or something, big ones, and they've got tails like scorpions, and these tails sting men and cause great pain and agony. And for a number of months, people will suffer under these things, and they cannot die. God actually stops death. Nobody can die for the months of this particular trumpet. But it specifically says, do not harm those who have been sealed by God. So we as believers will have nothing to fear from these guys, okay? At this point, I believe the demons are visible to us. I think that's partly because, they've been forced under the earth, and now there's something where they are visible in the natural realm. And I think there's going to be times when one of these creatures flies up to us, looks at us, sees the seal of God, and just ignores us. The guy standing next to us who's not a believer, he looks at him and he stings him, and he's under great torment and stuff like that. It's going to be a horrendous time to not be a believer. And the next trumpet, the sixth trumpet, there's another demonic horde released, but this one is released to kill a third of mankind. And some people think this is this billion-man army coming from China. This is a demonic horde. Their description is demonic. This is not just a symbol of human armies. And we'll talk about that just a little bit. But then comes the seventh trumpet. The seventh trumpet is what we're all longing for. The seventh trumpet, the final trumpet, Jesus returns. The church is raptured. The dead in Christ arise. It's going to be a glorious time when Jesus comes to the earth, begins his procession to Jerusalem, marching through the land, defeating the armies of the Antichrist, which takes us to the seven bowls. The seven bowls of wrath are the weapons that Jesus is using against the Antichrist and his armies. He's using these weapons to destroy the infrastructure of the Antichrist so that many things fail him in his attempt to defeat Jesus. Unnecessary. Jesus with a word could deal with it all, but he's doing this as a man. And so he's using, he's walking as a man, but he's walking in his divinity, and he's releasing these weapons of warfare against the Antichrist. The first one being malignant sores. Think about an army that's covered with boils. They can hardly function. It's too painful to wear their uniforms, to work with their equipment. All they want to do is sit and do whatever they can to ease the pain. The second bowl of wrath, all the seas are turned to blood, so that all the oceans are dead, okay? And it's not only dead, but everything in them is dead. And then we're told that every ship in them is destroyed. So think about this in terms of military. Most of our military moves from continent to continent via the sea. They do it through the air, but oftentimes their equipment is moved via the sea. So the seas turn to blood, and everything in the seas, oceans, are destroyed. It's a great weapon that Jesus has in store. The third bowl is all fresh waters turned to blood. And this is, just like what Moses did. He turned the water of the Nile to blood, and all the containers within Egypt that had water in them, it was turned to blood. There was no drinkable water. In this situation, the globe suddenly has no fresh water to drink. An army needs water to survive. Humans need water to survive. We're not here during this time because we now have our resurrected bodies. We're not affected by any of these bowls of wrath. We are not. We do not come under the wrath of God. The fourth bowl The sun scorches humanity. We don't know what exactly this looks like. Is there a little bit of a nova going on? Is the atmosphere thinning out in some way so that the sun's rays are more troublesome to humanity? But it's going to scorch humanity, and now you've got people all over the earth, with blisters and sunburns of degrees that are potentially deadly. Then the fifth bowl is poured out, and the beast kingdom is plunged into darkness. Again, think of Moses in Egypt. One of his plagues is he plunged the country of Egypt into darkness. And it says they didn't even leave their beds because they couldn't see anything, which means their candles didn't work. There was no light whatsoever. They couldn't see their hand in front of their face. And so think about this as a weapon against the beast and his armies. His nation, it could be just related to his 10-nation kingdom right around Israel. It could be the whole world. But an army that can't see can't move. It can't fight. None of their flashlights work. The house lights don't work. Candles don't work. Their computer screens, cell phones, there's no light. It's all darkness, absolute darkness. And so what happens? The army's stuck. They can't move. They can't do anything. They're just sitting there trembling. What's going on? And Jesus is marching to Jerusalem. He's following the path of the Israelites out of Egypt up to Jerusalem. Right? That takes him down through Edom, which is just south of the Dead Sea. And we're told that he marches through Edom and gets blood on his clothing. In this battle, everything's pitch black. And suddenly they hear this noise coming. And in an instant, the blazing glory of Jesus is there. And their eyes are open and they can't see anything because it's been so black. And they can't move and they're terrified. And Jesus slaughters them all. That's what the blood on his garments come from. That's the blood on his robe that we see in Revelation 19. The sixth bowl in Revelation 16 is poured out, and the Euphrates River is dried up for the kings that come from the east. Some people think this is the Chinese armies. Now, if these are the Chinese armies, and the sixth trumpet was the Chinese armies, they're in the wrong place. That doesn't work, okay? The timing's wrong. As it is, it wouldn't be time for the Chinese armies to arrive by land from China to Israel. I think that this is speaking of armies that are coming perhaps out of India, Iran, Iraq, places like that would have to cross the Euphrates to get there. And there was some barrier to that. These are latecomers to the battle. Maybe the Antichrist calls them out. I need your help. You've got to come. Because half his armies have been destroyed by now, if not more. And it's opened up so that they can come. But then the seventh bowl of wrath happens. And we hear the statement, it is finished. There's an earthquake that shakes the entire planet. And then there's 45-pound hailstones falling from the sky. Now, 45-pound hailstones coming at a velocity out of the air will go through just about anything, destroy pretty much everything it hits, kill whatever it hits. And the punishment for sin, for most sins in the Old Testament, was stoning. And so this is God's way of dealing with the sin on the earth at the very end. He's stoning those who have stood against Jesus. This is Jesus's weapon. And he's just, these kings coming from the east, he's decimating their armies with his hail. He's decimating the remaining armies that are around Jerusalem. And then he steps up and he confronts the Antichrist. It's going to be an amazing, incredible time. It's going to be so much chaos, confusion, pain, death. It's going to be a horrendous time to be on the planet, unless you're a believer, because you will be saved. You'll be excluded. You'll be protected from much of this. Amen.